They laughed when he first spoke, not openly at first, not in a way that could be punished, but with quiet smirks, exchanged glances, subtle chuckles behind hands as Major General Percy Hobart stood before a room filled with men who believed war had already evolved beyond him, men who believed brute force, air power, and traditional tanks were all that would be needed to retake Europe. And yet Hobart didn't see a battlefield on paper when he looked at the maps pinned to the walls. He saw a slaughter waiting to happen, a nightmare that would unfold the moment thousands of soldiers stepped off landing craft and onto beaches that had been transformed into a killing zone bristling with steel, explosives, concrete, wire, and perfectly placed guns, and while others imagined flags rising in victory, Hobart imagined bodies in tangled rows at the shoreline, young men pinned down behind shattered ramps with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, because what the others refused to acknowledge was that the German Atlantic Wall had turned the coast of France into a fortress, a dead zone designed to erase any invading force before it could even touch land. And when Hobart spoke about specially designed tanks, strange machines customized not for fighting other tanks, but for defeating the beach itself, the terrain, the obstacles, the very ground under their feet, they called it madness, said tanks were meant for mobility and firepower, not spinning chains, not floating skirts, not massive rolling drums, not bridge-laying contraptions, not bizarre mechanical arms meant to grab and pull and crush. They said his designs were not only useless but dangerous, that they would slow the invasion, waste resources, confuse troops, and fail the moment enemy fire touched them, and for a time they believed it so strongly that Hobart was quietly removed from meaningful command, pushed into obscurity while the war roared on without him, and perhaps that should have been the end of his story, another forgotten officer with strange ideas buried under tradition and ego. But the closer D-Day drew, the more the desperation grew, because every new reconnaissance photo of Normandy revealed the same truth. The beaches were lined with obstacles purposely designed to break landing craft, rip apart tanks, trap vehicles and funnel soldiers into narrow kill corridors guarded by machine guns, mortars, and artillery hidden in bunkers that could withstand heavy bombardment. And suddenly, no one had an answer for the single most important question in the entire operation. The question that would define victory or massacre: how would the first wave survive? How would any of them make it across that beach alive? And it was in that growing silence of uncertainty that someone finally spoke Hobart's name again. Quietly at first, then more seriously, then urgently. And when he was summoned back into a room of high-ranking planners and asked, almost reluctantly, if he truly believed his unorthodox machines could make a difference, he did not say a word more than necessary. He simply laid out his vision, described tanks that could clear mines as they advanced, tanks that could float onto the beach alongside infantry, tanks that could lay instant roadways over trenches and craters, tanks that could smash concrete walls and destroy steel barricades, tanks that would turn an impossible beach into a path forward. And this time there was no laughter, only a slow realization spreading through the room as imagination finally replaced denial. Because they could no longer pretend the conventional solution would work. The evidence of massacre was too clear, and with time running out, Hobart was given a second chance and a single mission: build the machines that could save the invasion. And so in secret workshops and muddy training grounds, under massive pressure and limited time, a new breed of armoured vehicles was constructed, tested, broken, redesigned, strengthened, built again, until each one performed a role that no normal vehicle could perform: flail tanks that violently spun chains into the sand, detonating mines before soldiers could ever step near them, amphibious tanks with floating screens capable of launching from the sea itself, bridge-layer tanks that unfolded giant steel spans over enemy ditches, armoured bulldozers that crushed obstacles, Avra tanks that fired massive explosive charges into concrete bunkers. And as the men trained with these machines, they too were mocked by others outside the program, called circus crews, novelty units, men hiding behind strange contraptions instead of real steel and real courage. But Hobart watched them carefully, drilled them mercilessly, refined every detail, every movement, every possibility of failure. Because he knew these machines would not be judged in conference rooms, they would be judged by machine gun fire, by explosions, by terrified soldiers praying for something to move them forward through hell. And when the final plans for D-Day were locked in, these odd vehicles, these strange inventions, were placed in the very front of the assault. A silent admission that perhaps the man they once laughed at had been right all along. And when the dark of June 5th faded into the early light of June 6th, and the largest fleet the world had ever seen moved toward the coastline of Normandy, the waves carrying thousands of terrified men toward their fate, very few of them knew that their survival depended not only on bravery or numbers or bombs, but on the so-called useless ideas of a man most of the army had once tried to forget, and as the landing craft began to shake under enemy fire and the shoreline erupted with explosions, as bullets tore through water and air alike, Hobart Essie's strange steel creations rolled forward with a purpose no ordinary machine had ever possessed. Flail tanks smashing the hidden mines that would have blown men apart, armoured engineers clearing paths through steel hedgehogs, and stakes designed to tear boats to pieces, bridge layers unfolding metal roads over trenches carved as traps, floating tanks emerging from the water to offer fire support where enemy commanders swore no armour could reach, and in sectors where these machines operated, soldiers began to move, inches at first, then feet, then yards, and for the first time that morning something incredible happened. Momentum replaced paralysis, hope replaced terror, while in other areas where Hobart's machines were not used, where old thinking still ruled, men were cut down in waves, pinned down, shredded by gunfire, beaches running red while they lay trapped behind steel and sand, and the difference between those two realities proved the truth in a way no argument ever could, because where the world had once laughed, men now walked forward alive, and in that contrast, Percy Hobart's so-called useless idea had already begun to carve its name into history. As the morning of June 6th dragged onward, and the beaches of Normandy became a chaotic mix of smoke, fire, water, blood, and twisted metal, German commanders watching from their hardened positions beyond the dunes began to feel something strange, something they had not been prepared for, because the killing fields they had spent months building were behaving differently than planned. The mines that were supposed to halt men and vehicles alike were erupting harmlessly in front of advancing machines. The trenches that had been dug to trap tanks and funnel soldiers into perfect lines of fire were being filled or crossed by rolling steel bridges. The concrete bunkers that were meant to withstand artillery were suddenly being punched open by massive explosive charges launched from short range straight into their heart. And the most terrifying sight of all, for those who had sworn this coast could never be breached, was the sight of enemy tanks appearing from the ocean itself, emerging through waves and smoke like creatures rising from another world. Because these were not ordinary machines, they were the physical manifestation of imagination, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept that tradition was correct. And as reports of failing defences spread up the German chain of command, confusion replaced certainty, because none of this had been in their calculations, none of this had been anticipated, and even the greatest walls are useless when the enemy brings ways to walk straight through them, and behind those walking machines came waves of Allied soldiers, men who had expected to die in minutes now finding narrow corridors of possibility opening in front of them, crawling, running, advancing behind the armoured shield created by Hobart S, so-called foolish toys, moving step by step toward positions that earlier would have been unreachable. And on those beaches, in that hellscape of noise and terror, Hobart's unmanned presence was felt more powerfully than any general physically walking the battlefield, because every time a mine exploded harmlessly in front of a flail, every time steel was pushed aside by a strange rolling drum, every time a bridge folded into place over a trap meant to consume dozens of lives, that was his mind speaking, his vision intervening, his once mocked idea turning death into motion. And as the hours passed, the impossible began to take shape. Allied forces established beachheads, supply lines began to form, tanks moved further inland, communications were restored, chaos slowly shifted into structure, and by evening the beaches that had been designed to swallow armies now held the first solid foothold of the liberation of Europe, a turning point that historians would analyse for decades, but soldiers would understand in the simplest possible terms. They were alive because someone had dared to think differently months earlier, and in distant headquarters where dust and fear and sounds of gunfire did not reach, those who had once dismissed Hobart's concepts were forced to sit in silence as reports came in, reading line after line of success attributed to odd machines, unusual vehicles, unconventional solutions, and though few of them would publicly admit it, inside they understood that a man they had nearly written off had provided one of the most crucial keys to the entire invasion. And as the days after D-Day unfolded into weeks, and Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, storming towns, crossing rivers, breaking lines the enemy believed were unbreakable, Hobart's machines and methods continued to play quiet but pivotal roles, clearing paths, creating passages, protecting men, solving problems that no standard vehicle could solve. And in that slow but steady progress toward victory, a new lesson ingrained itself into military thinking. Progress does not come from comfort. It comes from disruption. It comes from those willing to question what everyone else accepts as fact. And Percy Hobart did not live to see parades in his honour, or applause in packed halls, but he lived long enough to see European soil freed once more, long enough to know that the ideas he was forced to defend in isolation had saved thousands of lives and crushed barriers thought impenetrable, and in quiet moments away from cameras and praise, he remained unchanged, still practical, still grounded, still aware that what had truly won the day was not metal or machinery but mindset, the refusal to surrender to tradition, and that truth echoes far beyond Normandy, because every era has its own beaches, its own impossible obstacles lined with doubt and fear, its own armies convinced that only one path exists, and somewhere there is always someone being mocked, dismissed, set aside for thinking too differently, for building what looks too strange, for seeing what others refuse to see, until the moment comes where all existing plans fail, and only the so-called useless idea remains, standing alone as the final chance for survival, the final option for progress, the thin line between disaster and triumph, and the men who walked off those beaches, who later spoke of what they had witnessed, rarely spoke in technical terms or strategic analysis. They spoke of strange tanks that cleared the path, of bizarre machines that gave them cover, of a miracle that moved forward when everything else died, and without knowing it, they spoke the legacy of a forgotten general whose greatest victory was not commanding men to battle, but daring to imagine a world where those men might live. And that is why this story endures, why it matters, because it strips war down to something human, something painfully simple, that sometimes it is not strength that wins, not power, not numbers, but a thought that refuses to die, an idea that survives ridicule long enough to stand in the place where death was meant to be. And if you look closely at the major turning points of history, you will always find the same pattern hiding beneath the smoke, a voice that was once ignored, an invention that was laughed at, a warning that was brushed aside, and then the moment reality arrives and nothing else works, that is when the useless becomes essential, when the rejected becomes necessary, when the mocked becomes the difference between existence and extinction. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of all, not one about tanks or beaches or generals, but about human progress itself, that the future does not belong to those who cling to what is familiar. It belongs to those who dare to reimagine reality, even when the world tells them their ideas have no value. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, as the coastline of France burned and trembled beneath the weight of history, Percy Hobart's so-called useless idea did more than win a battle. It proved that imagination is a weapon, innovation is courage, and persistence in the face of doubt is the most decisive force of all.